Thank you all for joining us. It's unfortunate that we're not able to be in person today, but we're very grateful that that those of you have been able to join us online for this very important event that I am extremely proud that we're able to host at Georgetown and in the College of Arts and Sciences at Georgetown. I'm David Elstein. I'm the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Georgetown. I'm also proud to be a professor in our Department of Government and our School of Foreign Service, which only adds to my pride in this event that let me start by acknowledging some of our Georgetown sponsors of this event, the Government Department, the Conflict Resolution Program, the Democracy and Governance Program, our MS and our Masters of Science in Foreign Service program, as well as the Earth Commons Institute. One of the things that I take great pride in at Georgetown is the way that we collaborate across different institutions, and this event is illustrative of that. Let me also even sort of add an even bigger thanks to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists for partnering with Georgetown in this. This is something for which the Bulletin has, of course, become globally famous for and has a global impact in terms of the setting of the Doomsday Clock. And we're honored to be a part of this and to be able to host this event associated with that. Let me give you a sense of why we're so proud to be hosting this event at Georgetown. We often talk at Georgetown as we discuss our mission. One of the things that we mention as part of our mission in terms of educating, in addition to educating students and the formation of our students, one of the things that we hold central to our mission is serving the greater good. And this event, I think, in a way, connects to that mission of serving the greater good, of serving the common good. And you may ask yourself, well, how does this event do that, right? Or how does the setting of the Doomsday Clock do that? And I'll reflect that. So I am actually, one of the reasons this event is so meaningful to me personally is I'm a scholar of international security. As a kid, I grew up always sort of interested in the clock and where it was going to be set. And I think the Doomsday Clock has this remarkable effect of focusing the mind, right? In the sense that when we become aware of an event like this and the thought that's gone into it and the careful consideration by really kind of global experts on how to think about this question, it focuses us on the challenges that we face with regard to international security and in particular the challenges around nuclear weapons. And I think by doing so, it has this effect of forcing us, compelling us all to think about these challenges to global and international security, especially at a moment when, as we all know, there are so many other things going on in the world in which we're all focused, and this event forces us to think about these important questions. The other thing that is remarkable about this event, right, is that wherever the clock is set in any given year, right, and however that decision comes down, right, it opens up a series of provocative questions that I think it is healthy for us as informed citizens and as experts on this to engage with those questions. Questions about the nature of war, questions about the role of nuclear weapons on our planet, and not to be too grandiose about it, but about our shared human commitments to taking care of the planet, of society, and understanding the danger that nuclear weapons pose to all of that. So again, I'm extraordinarily proud that we're able to host this event at Georgetown, that the college and some of the units within the college have supported this. Let me, just in closing and turning it back to Professor Collin, thank her for all the work that she has put into organizing this on the Georgetown side. I'm enormously grateful. There's a team of people who have worked on this, but these events do not happen on their own, especially when on 24 or 48 hours notice, they need to be moved to Zoom and YouTube because we get hit with a snow slash ice slash freezing rain slash all the above storm. So thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to the students who I know are here. And unfortunately, I have to run off to other declinal duties, but I hope you have a productive and informative conversation. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Dean Edelstein. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. Um, Snowstorm aside.
Yes.
Um, and I am Professor Katherine Collin. I'm the director of the Georgetown Master's Program in Conflict Resolution in the Department of Government. And I'm your moderator for the next little while. We'll talk about today's setting of the 2026 Doomsday Clock. The Doomsday Clock is set by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and specifically the Science and Security Board at the Bulletin. And we're honored to have guests with us today from the Science and Security Board to talk to us about how close we are to human created existential destruction, how immediately threatening are human created existential threats at the moment. Um, Let me turn first to John Wolfsall to give us maybe an overview of this year's clock setting. Let me say first that John Wolfsall is the Director of Global Risk at the Federation of American Scientists. In addition to many roles inside government in policy and public affairs and public service, he's held a number of roles in civil society sectors as well. He served as a special assistant to President Obama for National Security Affairs and is a former senior director at the National Security Council for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. So, John, thanks for being with us. And maybe I can just ask you how close we are to midnight this year.
Sure. Katherine, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. Thanks to Dean Edelstein, who I know had to leave, and terribly sorry we're not all together in person. We've been together at Georgetown in the past, and I hope that you'll ask us back again in the future. This morning, the Bulletin Science and Security Board set the Doomsday Clock at 85 seconds to midnight. We moved the hands of the clock 4 seconds closer to midnight, and this now marks the closest to midnight that the hands of the clock have ever been. That is our way of saying that the leaders of the world, the citizens of the world, the nations of the world have not done enough to keep pace with the threats that we have identified and that are part of our remit, both nuclear dangers, climate change, which Inez Fung, my colleague, is eminently placed to talk about, and disruptive technologies, both in the biological weapons space, but also in the increasingly and accelerating world of artificial intelligence, and how that affects both information, misinformation, and disinformation. So we're at a perilous time. All of these issues were part of the discussions that the Bulletin Science and Security Board discussed in our deliberations throughout the year. And today we've had the sad but important task of sharing with the world that, in our view, we're closer to midnight than we've ever been. My leader, Daniel Holtz, who's the chairman of the board, has just joined us, and I'll just let him know that we've summed up, Dan, some of the basic details from our release this morning. And Katherine, Collin, who's the head of the conflict resolution program at Georgetown, is our host. She just asked me to tee things up, and I'm going to turn things back over to her.
Thanks so much, John. I have questions to ask you about nuclear weapons proliferation, so let us come back to you in just a minute. But let me introduce Daniel Holtz, who is just joining us. Professor Daniel Holtz is the chair of the Science and Security Board for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. He's a professor at the University of Chicago in departments of physics, astronomy and astrophysics, and the Enrico Fermi Institute, and the Kavli Institute for Cosmological Physics. In other words, he is doing the hard science for us. Welcome to the social science side of the fence, Professor Holtz. He also studies existential risk, and so is well-positioned to chair the Science and Security Board at the Bulletin. So Professor Holtz, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, and
John,
thanks for having me. And
yeah,
my apologies for being late. I actually was doing an interview with Fox Chicago. And
far be it for me to want to compete with Fox Chicago.
well, they do actually a very good job of covering these sorts of issues.
John was just telling us that we are 85 seconds to midnight, and laying out some of the considerations for why that is so. Maybe I can ask you to do a little further situating and maybe, lend your expertise to how we are at the closest to midnight we've ever been, right?
Yeah, so yeah, and I'm worried I'm gonna repeat. Yeah, so 85 seconds is the closest we've ever been. Um, we jumped from 89 seconds to 85. And the main reason for that, is I'm sure John talked about, is that there just hasn't been progress on the major issues of concern. And so we can kind of go through all of them. We worry, of course, about the nuclear threat. We also worry about climate change. We worry about biological threats. And then we worry about other things on the horizon. Sort of mis and disinformation is, of course, something we're becoming increasingly familiar with. AI and the way AI supercharges this information is something of grave concern. And we're worried about things like the rise of autocratic governments that are less and less um, uh, sort of accountable to their citizens. And this is happening globally. So all of these things are of concern. In our assessment on each of these in turn, looked at separately, things are getting worse. And then when you combine it all, we came to the consensus that we're at 85 seconds.
Let me maybe ask Professor Fong to come in. Professor Fong is a professor emerita of atmospheric science in the Department of Earth and Planetary Science, and the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Fong, could you speak to the climate change issues that are at play in these considerations?
You're muted, Ines.
I don't have to remind everybody that the weather has gone totally wild, chaotic, erratic. Okay, and I'm just checking up while we are thinking about the winter storm, which to me is, wow, the oceans are much warmer than normal. And then we have the Weather Service had the perfect analogy. There's the Pineapple Express, the warm, moist air from the Pacific coming southward, and then it meets the Siberian Express. Okay, so the two together gave us this storm, and whether you are south of the meeting line, the boundary, the front, you get rain, a lot of rain, and you get snow north of it and sleet in the middle. Okay, so when you're shoveling, think about the Pineapple Express meeting the Siberian Express. But that's, if you think back to 2023 in February, it was actually 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so the chaotic weather is part of this. Okay, so the impact to people, it's not just, I'm often asked, who cares about 1.5 degrees? The background temperatures, like the fever I have, okay? So everything else becomes chaotic, and because of the warming. And so when we think about the record, everyone has seen the Mauna Loa CO2 record going, but in the nearly 200-year temperature record, thermometer record, I've been teaching for a while, the warmest 10 years, it's always the most recent 10 years is the warmest 10 years. So we're breaking records. We are seeing the impacts of the change. But more importantly, the CO2 is going up. And we know from the physics, from the radiative properties of CO2, how CO2 And what is seldom said is CO2 has a buddy, it's a friend, and it's water. Okay, so water vapor, when it is warmer, there's more evaporation from the oceans, and water vapor is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2, and water vapor is more abundant than CO2. So if we stopped the emission right now, okay, if we stop CO2 emission, water vapor, the CO2 will slowly decrease, okay, and will continue to contribute to the warming, but water vapor will continue to act and warm. So even if we dream about stopping emission today, we will continue the weather that we're experiencing now. The chaotic stuff will continue. And that's where, to me, is the concern. It will be tough to think about removing CO2 and going back. We're not there. The technology is not there. It's too expensive. It's still experimental. We don't have a cure. Okay, we don't have a cure for the problem. So I'm very concerned because the science has been robust. I've been working on it for 40 years. What we said 40 years ago still holds. Now we have more observations to confirm. We have richer description of the impacts, but the outline is still there. Physics works, okay? The science works. Okay, so yes, we have the oceans are taking up 90%, over 90% of the added heat. So we're waiting for the ocean to come to do its thing. But while the ocean is taking up the heat, it's evaporating water vapor. Okay, and that's the greenhouse gas, and that really is magnifying, amplifying the CO2 effect, the greenhouse gas effect. So to me, we have to go, yes, we have to work on adaptation, building seawalls or sea level rise, whatever you have to do. But the cause, we have to work on the cause, okay, which is the emission, the reducing the emission. And we're ready. Okay, that's the thing that hurts me the most, is that the renewable technology last year around the globe, not in the US, but around the globe, the portion of energy attributed to renewal is greater than that attributed to coal. So renewable, not everything is ready, but a lot of the renewable energy technologies are ready, mature, and affordable. So it really hurts me to sit here and this inaction and the energy spent on the disinformation rather than spending energy on reducing the emission, and we should be spending energy there as well as on adaptation and mitigation. I'm sorry, it's been a long haul for me.
I don't think the water vapor part of what you said just now gets talked about nearly enough. It's
No, we have 70% of the ocean surface is water. And my laundry dries faster, okay, when it is dry outside, right? That's evaporation. The water vapor, I tell my students, I come out of the shower, I come to school with wet hair and then it dries in a day. Where does the water go? The water goes into the atmosphere, evaporate. I am providing the energy to evaporate the water that goes into the atmosphere. So water vapor is increasing, and we do have satellite records that are showing the increase in water vapor, in addition to the temperature, in addition to everything else that we're seeing.
I want to
let me add one other thing.
Yes.
The CO2 increasing, what we haven't talked about much is that when you look at oxygen is decreasing, not to the, in the million parts per million, okay? oxygen is their percent, so that little bit of loss of oxygen is not something I have to worry about breathing. But it shows that it is combustion. Combustion uses up oxygen. Okay, so as the CO2 is rising, the oxygen is decreasing in the proportion that we would expect the combustion to take place. So I'm very, I can go on and on, but the oxygen story is also not talked about before.
Which is evidence for
That, yeah, when they say, when I'm asked, this is natural fluctuation. Yeah, if you talk about millions of years, CO2 have gone up and down, but the most recent record, when we have super high resolution measurement of oxygen that is decreasing, we know. Okay, we also have carbon-14 that says that the ratio of the old carbon to new carbon. Okay, there are many lines of evidence to show that it is the CO2 in the physics, and everything else says that it is the CO2 that is causing the warming. And the CO2 has a buddy called water.
I want to pivot slightly to another overarching existential concern of the bulletins, and ask maybe Daniel, John, whoever wants to take this. Can you give us this kind of overview for nuclear weapons proliferation? Where are we in, 85 seconds to midnight? Where are we with nuclear weapons?
John, that's all you.
So like Inez, I've been doing this quite a long time. I got involved in nuclear weapons in the mid-1980s. And, the public can be excused for thinking this problem was taken care of, right? The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union fell apart. We were told that the nuclear danger had been handled. And yet here we are with nuclear weapons threats, nuclear weapons modernization, the threat that more countries will get nuclear weapons being in the news every day. And this is what it was like during the Cold War. You could not escape nuclear dangers. And every day we knew that the nuclear sword of Damocles hung over our heads. So sadly, this generation now has to wrestle anew with the nuclear dynamics, but in an even more complicated way than I did in my youth, because back then we worried about the United States and Soviet Union blowing each other up. And as long as we had two relatively sane actors in Moscow and the United States, we were able to navigate many of the dangers and risks and accidents that happened on a regular basis. You now have 9 countries with nuclear weapons. You have 7 of them under autocratic leadership or budding autocrats who are no longer fully accountable to their populations or who dream of not being accountable to their populations. All of them are men, by the way. And all of them are expanding the role that nuclear weapons play in their security, not just for defense, but or deterrence, but for coercion, for blackmail, and openly talking about the utility, the usability of nuclear weapons on the battlefield. It's not just Russia that says, oh, well, we might have to use a nuke in Ukraine. North Korea talks about this pretty regularly. The United States talks about this increasingly. And so when you look at the hundreds of billions of dollars being spent on nuclear weapons, when you look at the lack of attention that the leadership is paying to the risks and the lack of awareness that the leadership really has about how these risks can metastasize and grow out of their control, we point to this as a dramatic concern. And to put a fine point on it, it was hard, nigh impossible for us to find one piece of good news in the nuclear landscape over this past year that could allow us to say, well, maybe we don't have to move the clock quite so aggressively. The only thing we could point to is that the United States, Donald Trump has said over and over, well, nuclear weapons are dangerous. We should work to get rid of them. But he hasn't done anything about them. Russia has offered to extend the treaty we have with them that's due to expire in 9 days, the New START treaty, which I helped negotiate, and maintain those limits. And Donald Trump hasn't picked up the phone and called Putin and said, yeah, that's a good idea. So in 9 days, we will, for the first time in over 50 years, be without any limits over the nuclear weapons the United States and Russia can deploy. And that's the definition of a bad development.
And Daniel, could I ask you a kind of a way to think about both of these things in relationship to each other? Maybe you can tackle some governance issues for me. You know, in conflict resolution, we talk about the ways that when you handle crises, you increase your demand for governance while you simultaneously decrease your supply of it. And, you know, John's talking about autocratization. I heard him just put the United States on a particular side of the democracy versus autocracy line. And you know, the withdrawal from multilateral space, right? This month we've taken a big step back, the United States, out of multilateral governance. How, you know, where does governance play into the way that we should be understanding this as a crisis?
Yeah, I think that summary was very apt. I think John was careful to just say 7 out of 9, but not actually list. So, but yes.
I also said, I said either autocratic or dream of being autocratic.
Yes. Okay. All right. There you go. So it's just as you said, it's a moment where these sort of international institutions and international agreements are essential to addressing these risks, and really for all of the risks. I mean, you could take AI, for example. To kind of control AI will require some sort of international regulations, agreed upon kind of norms that would govern the way these systems are built and trained. For every risk we consider, we need some sort of global engagement. It's very hard to make progress just one nation alone. And so, for example, on climate, if the US runs off headlong to burning coal, that does tremendous damage. Of course, we still want the rest of the world to go to renewables and not give up, but really it's something where all of us need to take those positive steps. Similarly with nuclear, it's very hard to make progress if you're undermining things like New START and not kind of following it on. Like, I think we have lots of evidence that over the past decades, part of what got us through, part of the reason that we made it through 75 years of nuclear weapons, is that we made the effort to come up with these agreements and did the hard work, and it was hard work to kind of come to the table. And even when the US and the Soviet Union were, avowed public bitter enemies, behind the scenes, the work was going on to make sure that a nuclear war, which would be in nobody's interest, that would not happen, or at least decrease the probability that would happen. And it's really that kind of the lessons we learned post-World War II. One framing of this is there's this kind of, we've had these global norms and understandings which have produced this long peace of 80 years without major global conflict, and that those norms and understandings are falling by the wayside, one after the other, and the agreements that underpin them are falling by the wayside. And that's terrifying, because if it means we're kind of reverting back to an age where world wars are something that happen with some regularity, Now it's world wars with nuclear weapons. It's fairly clear that that is a fundamental shift in the way civilization operates, and we don't just recover from that. So that's all a long-winded way to say precisely at the moment where we need more global cooperation and we need to do the hard work to reduce these risks. At least some nations, and probably the key nations, are running as fast as they can the other way and breaking everything as they go. So it's not good. It's 85 seconds.
So more of a rupture than a transition, you might say. Yeah. We are privileged to be joined by Professor Steve Fetter, who is a professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, the board vice chair for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Board of Science and Security, and an expert on arms control, nuclear arms control and non-proliferation, nuclear energy, and climate change. So maybe, oh, he's in listen only mode. Okay, wonderful. So just to acknowledge, Steve, we see you. Thank you for joining us. So let me ask maybe the panel, and then I can turn it over to my students and the community more broadly. We've talked about governance. We've talked about the rollback of nuclear non-proliferation controls. We've talked about rising climate change and the expectation that temperatures will continue to rise. What have we not talked about yet that you think it's essential for us to understand in terms of the board's thought process for the clock this year?
I'll jump in just for a minute. I think there are two things that probably, well, there are a lot of things we talked about, but including my bad jokes about whether time is relative or not. Daniel, it's another nickel for you. The first is there is a glimmer of hope out there, and that is the technology is rapidly advancing. And Inez spoke to this about the pace of and affordability of renewable technologies, but across the board, right? It's a remarkable period that we're in. The development of artificial intelligence and how it could be used to verify arms control agreements, how it could be used to fact check information and ensure that disinformation isn't running wild. Your ability to use artificial intelligence or advanced technologies to detect pandemics and address them before they begin, to develop vaccines so you can protect and insulate your population. So, it's not like we're we are the definition of pro-technology. We're just worried about the double-edged sword nature of the technology and how it's being used or not used. And so we spent a lot of time talking about that and the promise of the period we're in, if we could just get our national governments, state governments, international collaboration to work together. I think the other factor here that we didn't really get into, and this was not done specifically focused on, say, the Trump administration, but obviously the actions of the US over the last year, it's this rejection of science and technology, underfunding, undervalue, the gutting of National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, investments in universities. Other countries like China are investing heavily, but we worry about how they will use that technology, how they will use that expertise in a way that's not accountable, not transparent. But this is a dynamic that we're seeing across the board, whether it's the breakdown in society. Maria Ressa at our press conference this afternoon or this morning talked about this, information Armageddon, and added is this battle between science and truth and misinformation and ecosystem control. And that's underlying everything that we were talking about. And we don't have, we talk about disruptive technology as part of the clock setting, but this underlying dynamic in societies, which we're watching, we know we don't have necessarily control over, but we worry a lot about, and how it affects these existential threats is very much on our mind.
I want to add to that, to what John is saying, is that what Maria pointed out also, this morning is where the controls are. And it is the controls are in big business, in, not just the tech bros, but when I think about energy, we're going back to coal power plants, et cetera, and doing away with, we are being threatened with the removal of the EPA endangerment finding. And that impacts, so it's not just an issue of climate change, it is an issue of large-scale government policies that are focused on, they should be focused on the population, the health and the well-being of population, rather than the interests of big corporations. And that to me, it's a difficult fight to engage in because of the resources, because of I'm speaking for myself. I don't know how to talk to somebody who lies to me in my face, right? So it's there are many things that we have to learn. How do we prepare ourselves, not just to do the science and do the good work, but how do we protect the science and communicate the science? And something that Maria pointed out, you have fact, and then you have truth, and then you have trust. Okay, but how do we do the first step and not have the facts be mixed up or inverted and whatever? And I think that's something that all of us can learn how to do.
Yeah, I'll add one thing to this, which I think was something that we spent some time on in the press conference and just more generally, which is the hopeful part of this. The fact that this whole exercise really is about turning back the clock. That the Doomsday Clock is that the reason we're doing this is because we believe the clock should be turned back and can be turned back. And one of the things that, comes up often is that none of these challenges are sort of a foregone conclusion. In fact, we're in the very fortunate position that they can all be addressed. And I think climate is a great example. You could imagine that there would be no way to power our civilizations without burning fossil fuels. And that would have been more or less the state of affairs maybe 15 or 20 years ago. And that would have been too bad, because then it might have been hard choices need to be made. But that is not the way technology has evolved. And now there are many alternatives, and the alternatives are cleaner and less expensive. And so there is a clear path forward. It didn't have to be that way. Physics does not say absolutely right when you need it, we will magically come up with inexpensive solar panels. That is, we're very fortunate that's where we are. Part of it is because of human ingenuity, which has its benefits. It also has its downsides, which is, as John was saying, this double-edged sword. But in this case, we have the technologies. It's really just a question of political leadership and kind of the world working together to move forward you really take advantage of those technologies and stop burning fossil fuels. And that's true for many of the things. As John said, one call from Trump and, some version of New START could still be in place. And that obviously benefits everyone. And so that could happen tomorrow. And so there are many, many things that could give us hope and that could turn back the clock. And finally, one of the main messages is one towards probably your students, towards the next generation, which is it's extraordinarily important to be engaged on these issues, to be informed, and to take action. And there's a wide range of actions. Everyone can sort of figure out how to have impact and be creative and passionate and use your energies to make a difference. And there are many things that can be done. Of course, you can vote and you can get engaged in local politics or go to rallies. You can talk to your friends and family, but then whatever it is, if you want to be a journalist or a lawyer or an academic, you can inform what you do in the world with this knowledge that the doomsday clock's at 85 seconds. If it goes to midnight, nothing else matters. But there are many things that can be done. These risks, I mean, there's a broad range of risks, and there are many ways to kind of make progress. And the only way that we will kind of get through this is to have the public engaged. It's in all of our interest to do this. This is what we need. This is what the doomsday clock is about, is to have that happen.
In many ways, you're speaking here to the choir, because conflict resolution is about how to organize that kind of engagement on a lot of levels. So that's a perfect transition maybe toward my students. So my students are in the Zoom room with us, and I've asked them to ask you some questions about the presentation. So students, maybe you could raise your hand and turn on your camera to indicate that you would like to, break the seal and ask a first question. Okay, hi, Cynthia Sparrow is excellent at this. She excels in this regard, asking the first question. So Cynthia, please go ahead.
Yeah, something that I've kind of wondered a decent bit, I'm very familiar with your work, is the concept of midnight. And I have a sort of two-in-one question that relates to the concept, which is, what is midnight? And more importantly, what happens after?
Okay, I can start on that. And I think so. First of all, we don't have a single answer to what is midnight. I think people kind of come at this with their own kind of nuances. I think there's some sense, we talk generally, midnight is the end of civilization, the end of kind of life as we know it. If if humans are extinct, that's pretty clearly midnight. If some humans are still around, but all the major urban areas are reduced to radioactive rubble, and there's no more power, and there's mass starvation, and you can kind of go through these things and imagine scenarios that sound like midnight. The one kind of pithy way to say this is, when it's midnight, there won't be a Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. We won't be gathering to set the clock because it just won't be possible. We won't be around to do it. So this kind of relates to your, post-midnight question. We don't spend a lot of time, our goal is to prevent midnight. So we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, if there, 1,000 people left on Earth, how do they recover? That it's not that's not where we want to spend our energies. There are interesting questions there. There are groups that are so convinced that we're going to hit midnight, that is the only reasonable thing to do. I'm not in that camp. Most of us are not in that camp. That's why we do this, because we're trying to turn back the clock. So that's my kind of, I'm not speaking for the broad organization. So John and Inez could easily have kind of different feelings about what midnight is about.
Okay, so basically it can be anywhere between Bronze Age collapse level and complete and total extinction, but the general litmus test is if you're not really able to set the clock anymore, that's probably a bad sign.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to describe it.
Professor Fong, did you want to add something there?
In the climate science world, we make projections. We make projections to 2100, and then we make projections beyond that. And, of course, we also study past climates for the last million or more years. To answer the question about what is midnight, it is so difficult, as Dan has mentioned, to say what happens. To us, we're projecting. If we use energy, if we have fossil fuel emissions like this or greenhouse gas trends like this, then what would happen to the ecosystems? What would happen to precipitation changes? What would happen to extreme weather, to hurricanes, to typhoons, anything? Okay, all of that we go through that set of thinking, what changes in the ocean, the acidification of the ocean, what happened to the food, the protein sources, what happened to all of that. So we're not talking about midnight because that's not, but we are looking at a very different world from the one that we are familiar with. At least when I say we, I'm going to say in the history of documented human civilization, we're entering a world with no prior analog. So one of the things from my perspective is how do we prepare for that? How do we prepare when, we have built reservoirs here, but the rainfall patterns will shift, and so it won't rain where the reservoirs are, or sea level rises, all sorts of, I won't go through all the scenarios, but part of our concern is here are likely scenarios of what might happen to ecosystems, to butterflies, to birds, to the whole inhabitants of the planet. So how do we prepare for that? And I think that's where, to me, the setting the clock or just saying we are closer to something that we are not prepared for. And so it's time to turn back, or if we, what future do we want? It won't be the same as the one we've got.
Stephanie, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for this discussion. Yeah, I have maybe like two questions, but I definitely strongly agree with the underlying part about the increasing number of anti-science individuals in the society, like how this trend is developing not only like in the general public, but also in policymakers. I feel that this is not only happening like in the big countries like the US, but also in my countries like Indonesia and Asia. Like our government also struggles to listen to experts, especially not just in the science, but also in social and political science right now. So, in your opinion, like how can we change this situation? Like, how can we convince policymakers to listen to us? And how can we like transform this situation to an opportunity for a better future, I guess? So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
But everyone doesn't have a quick, easy answer to that. Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And I think and again, I think this is a kind of global phenomenon of kind of the respect for science or for expertise more generally is in decline. But okay, as an academic, my perception is that at least here in the bubble I'm in, as it were, there's been a backlash is too strong, but there's been an awareness that science and technology really are the basis of thriving economies, and and you destroy that at your peril. And so this notion both from just naked self-interest, from a national naked self-interest, that if you want to succeed, you need to invest in science and technology. I feel like that argument is, I'm hearing it increasingly made, and in fact, even in the darkest of days in terms of academia and attacks on academia, there's still nonetheless, we have to fund quantum science and we have to fund AI, and of course we have to lead in the most important science and technological subjects. So for what it's worth, there's some hope there. I think also my impression is that sort of globally, the questions of, are these things happening? Is climate change happening? The scientists say it is. Oh, it's all a hoax. The number of people in the hoax camp, from what I can tell, and as may feel differently, but from what I can tell, that's an increasingly small and kind of fringe group. Unfortunately, part of the reason for that is because it's just so manifestly obvious at this point that it's very hard to, reality at some point intrudes. And I think that's true for many things. And so even for things like vaccination schedules and, at the end of the day, biology works the way it does, and bad things will happen unless we kind of listen to the scientists and listen to the experts. So I feel like maybe there's some hope there, but I don't want to be overly rosy about it. The attacks on science and academia are debilitating and will have long-term consequences. And for example, as has been mentioned, we could be one of the things we've benefited from, by we I mean US academia, is that we attract the best and brightest from around the world. And that could be changing. And that does have long-term repercussions.
I'll just weigh in here very briefly. This is outside my nuclear expertise, but something as a former national security official I watch. The war on expertise and on science is not a bug, it's a feature. It's a feature of the autocratic playbook because it's an alternate source of authority that can challenge illiberal autocratic dictators, right? And Donald Trump talked about this in his first inauguration speech. Only I can fix it. I don't have to listen to anybody. I know the right answer. Well, it turns out there are a lot of people who actually have very good ideas and constructive answers on how you solve complicated problems. They may be at odds, however, with his ultimate strategy for whether that's personal profit, consolidation of power, whatever it happens to be. And we've seen this play out in Russia, China, Hungary, Pakistan, India. I mean, it's happening all over the world. And these strategies are interconnected. We have borders, which is great, but the political strategies are not only sort of permeating, but they're orchestrated and they're self-reinforcing. And that's part of what we have to be aware of. The solution is much more complicated, and Daniel talked to some of those. I'm a big fan of educate, 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 but it has to be more complicated than just the education piece.
We have a question that turns toward conflict from the YouTube chat, actually from a professor in our program who looks at corruption and its connections to conflict and security. And he says he's looking for some good news. In evaluating nuclear risks, did the experts take into consideration the Israel-US successes in setting back Iran's nuclear program?
we definitely looked at this and had a long discussion about it. I think there are some big question marks and big gaps in our knowledge about the ultimate success of what Israel and the United States were able to do. There's no question that had Iran wanted to start building a nuclear weapon a year ago, they would have been able to complete it more quickly than they would be able to do it today. So have we slowed down the Iranian nuclear capability? We don't know that they were looking to build a bomb, but they clearly had access to the material. But at the same time, that material is still there. We just don't have access to it. We don't know where it is. We don't know what form it's in. It's not under international inspections. Do we know where they have moved it to, and could they be working on weaponization now? We don't know. So you can say, all right, well, we set that program back. We blew up a couple of facilities. That slowed down the program. But then we also weighed the fact that you have two nuclear armed states acting without a UN mandate, acting without a clear justification for self-defense, taking action against a sovereign state, and then literally destroying the verification regime that was the link that allowed us to know what they were doing. And so it was very hard for us to say this is an absolute disaster. It was also very hard for us to say that this is definitely a bright point, but it definitely factored into our decision and our discussions, but it wasn't clear cut one way or the other.
Just thinking about the year in conflict and including with nuclear armed actors, I wonder if you considered any of the other ongoing conflicts or the threatened conflicts that have been happening, including, making peace in Syria, but also thinking about, Sudan, Ukraine, other, events in the Middle East, India, Pakistan, whether that it was, whether these kinds of events are something that you look to when you're making your decision.
Well, I mean, again, John can speak to this more, but yes, I mean, all of those were part of the discussion. And in particular, conflicts, active conflicts that involve nuclear nations always get our attention. And so in the one we were just describing with the US and Israel, India and Pakistan, two, nuclear nations, they have nuclear weapons. There's long-standing enmity between them in a hot war. There is no way not to be, incredibly alarmed. You have to be alarmed by that, and that is one of the kind of classic scenarios by which nuclear weapons are used, and their stockpiles are significant enough that that would have catastrophic consequences globally in terms of impact on the environment and widespread famine and hundreds of millions of fatalities. And there are papers that kind of go through these numbers. So the idea that you could have a small regional conflict there and it would be fine, that is false. And here they were, actively, engaged in a conflict. So that definitely gets your attention. And of course, Ukraine, it's still ongoing. Putin has made very clear, nuclear threats. There's been a lot of saber rattling. How that plays out is still somewhat unclear. I think there's a sense that maybe the worst of the nuclear risk has maybe subsided a little bit, but it's still there, and it's very hard to know how that might evolve. So yes, all of these things factor into our overall sense of the state of the world.
I have another question from one of my students here, who asks what non-proliferation strategies might reduce the perceived risk associated with Iran's nuclear activities. So, how might we redress the verification regime violations in the future? Yeah, John.
Yeah, there's no clear pathway now for dealing with Iran's nuclear future. We have tried multiple strategies in the past, both the United States and our partners, we've tried sanctions, we've tried negotiations. The only thing that's ever made any real progress is when we negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015, which limited and constrained Iran's nuclear capability, kept them a year away from a bomb. This is the agreement that Donald Trump withdrew from in his first term, and Iran has advanced its nuclear program ever since. The Iranian regime right now is under siege from its own people. It no longer understands or knows whether it has the ability to survive, is looking for both control and legitimacy, and it's very possible that nuclear weapons is one pathway for that. One thing the United States and Israel do have to offer, however, and I'm not advocating for this, I'm just saying as an analyst, you look at what's on the table. The United States and Israel could say, we're prepared to refrain from further attacks if you give up all your nuclear capability. Get rid of the uranium, agree to never have enrichment, give it all up, and we will, like we promised to do with Libya but never followed through, say, we will respect your territorial integrity and leave the future of Iran up to the Iranian people and so forth. Again, I'm not advocating for that because I think there are a lot of people right now, particularly in Israel, saying now's the time to go after the Iranian regime and get rid of them. And I don't know that an argument that, well, we can stem the nuclear tide will be attractive to either Netanyahu or to Trump. But that's, I think, the sort of dynamic that we have. What I do know is whether Iran builds a nuclear weapon in the near term or in the long term, or just retains its nuclear latency, the perceived value of having a nuclear weapon in the world has gone way up, right? If you were a betting man or woman, or you were investing in nuclear futures, you'd be betting long term. And that's both because the attacks in Iran have shown, well, gee, we don't want you to have a nuclear weapon. There must be something in it. Ukraine, which inherited nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union, never had full possession or use of them, but is now widely perceived as having made a mistake by returning those weapons to Russia because the United States, UK, and Russia didn't respect and defend their territorial integrity. And the United States is actively talking about invading one of its allies in Europe, in Greenland. And our allies are now rapidly trying to figure out, okay, if the United States is not a reliable partner, who's going to defend us? And if we can't rely on somebody to defend us, do we have to defend ourselves? That's the world we're worried about, where not just 9 nuclear weapons, but 19 countries have nuclear weapons. This is the world that John F. Kennedy warned about in the early 1960s, that we could see a rapid proliferation, a rapid spread of nuclear weapons because they're seen as legitimate, effective tools for statecraft. And that's what we've worked very effectively to prevent, and that's rapidly unraveling.
And just to add, I mean, North Korea is, of course, another example of, the utility of these weapons. And I think, John basically just said this, but one of the major successes of the Cold War, I mean, we came very close to disaster many times, but one of the clear successes was that there are not now 100 nations with nuclear weapons, which there easily could have been, and which I think a lot of people thought would have been, if you had talked to them in the 50s, would have said that is where this is headed. And at least from what I can tell, the increasing number of nuclear weapon states, the increasing sort of number of pairs of interactions you can have that go wrong that end up in nuclear exchange. And so it's fairly clear that keeping the number small, again, John alluded to this, if you've got just 2 major poles, the US and the Soviet Union, that's somewhat stable. Even with 3, now people talk about US, Russia, and China, it's already much more unstable, and how to govern that. And John is smiling probably because I'm about to start talking about the 3-body problem, which I won't get into, but is a well-known problem in physics. And 2 bodies are stable mathematically, and 3 bodies are not. And that kind of goes over into foreign policy, it turns out. And as we get more and more nations and more independent nations with nuclear weapons, the problem rapidly gets extraordinarily complicated. And if you don't solve it correctly, the consequences are dire for everyone. So this is a major issue for all of us.
have several thought bubbles of follow-up questions about nuclear testing and nuclear power, but we have a good question in the coming in from YouTube. So let me shift our attention a little bit. But if we'd like to revisit some of the nuclear, happy to go there. Here's the question, though. We've glanced over this briefly. Could you please talk a bit more about how pandemics and biotech or biological threats have informed this year's decision? I know we don't have our public health.
We don't have our public health expert, so I can give a go, and then John and Inez can certainly correct me when I say things that are manifestly wrong. The general thing, so we talk, and I should say there, we have this clock statement, and there are sidebars, what we call sidebars, and there's a detailed sidebar on the biological threat and what the concerns are there. And so I would encourage everyone to read all of the sidebars, but specifically that sidebar goes into many of the concerns. And there were a number of different levels of concern. One very clear concern is the possibility of synthetic mirror life, which is, and I think this is a good encapsulation of what the Doomsday Clock and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is about. It's trying to anticipate threats to civilization from technological advances. And this is one of those examples. All life on Earth has a certain handedness, the way DNA twists, it's one direction and not the other. And then RNA, twists the other, and everything matches, everything fits together in a very specific way. So, some things are right-handed at their, genetic level, at the most basic level. Some things are left-handed, and everything fits. Now, one of the things that's been asked in biology is, well, what if you make something that has the opposite handedness? Wouldn't that be cool? And maybe it'll have some applications for a drug delivery or something. Wouldn't that be neat? And so there's been a lot of interest there. And what's been realized in the last few years is that there is a chance, and maybe a high chance, that if you were to synthesize this, because nothing on Earth has evolved to kind of be a predator to this stuff, to consume it, to limit it in any way, this stuff would just take over. If you had the wrong-handedness and it could reproduce and grow, it would grow without bound until it destroyed the Earth, all living things on Earth. So it's not clear that that's what would happen, but there's a reasonable chance people that study these things and think about it think, yeah, actually that could easily happen, to the level in which we should probably not do that. Maybe we should step back from that. And there were groups that were actively trying to make this mirror life. And so this is one of these few examples where the international community has come together and said, maybe we should pause on that and think it through, because if this goes badly, that would have broad implications. So that's something you could worry about. Like many things, to really address it, you need international cooperation, you need respect for science, you need a lot of things to go right. And in the current climate where, again, it's us versus them and everyone's competing, it's hard to know how you get the regulations you need to control those sorts of developments. And this is just one thing which wasn't on anybody's radar 5 years ago and is now something that we really need to keep track of. In biology in general, and I know Inez and John will probably back me up on this, often the biologists terrify everyone else on the Science and Security Board. We feel like we have a good sense of things, and then they come up with a scenario which really would be terrible. I mean, just mirror life is a good example where you think you kind of have a handle on things, and then they really throw a wrench into it. So that's one of the things that we discussed. But then, of course, the decline of public health and the respect for health expertise in the US, that actually has also global repercussions. So that's something of concern. The general politicization of health is a big concern to address things like COVID or the next pandemic, which could be much, much worse than COVID. That requires working together globally. We need monitoring systems, and we need ways to identify and track and synthesize, and all that requires countries working together. That seems, in many ways, we're less prepared now than we were at the beginning of the COVID pandemic for the next pandemic. And that fact is profoundly unsettling. And that alone would be, a big reason to kind of change the time on the clock, because, pandemics come with regularity. And now, with the possibility of, weaponized or kind of synthetic engineered pandemics, that adds a certain level of danger. And now with AI fueled engineered pandemics, where AI can help even small groups potentially develop very dangerous pathogens, that adds yet another level of danger. And yet, meanwhile, our ability to address these dangers is decreasing. So that's my kind of summary. I've probably left some things out, but that alone is enough to kind of give you pause. And yeah, Inez, please.
When I think about nuclear threats and climate change, I think I can point to big actors, the energy system or the nations, the pandemics. To me, pandemics are one airplane ride away. Somebody gets on the plane, okay? And so that's where, to me, it's scary because it is unpredictable. But what the threat to me also, given the current situation, is the science, the NIH, the research to work on vaccines and to work on drugs that would combat whatever might come our way. And I think that is on a very personal level. It's not just the big actors, this unpredictable one airplane ride away. And we are unprepared for that. If we go back to the history, when we first got COVID, when COVID first came onto our radars, there have been people, scientists working, doing things that saying words that we cannot pronounce, et cetera, working just in anticipation of all kinds of things that, that's what the scientists in lab coats do, right? So to me, the scary part is not just the one airplane ride away, but the loss of that capability, or the decimation, reduction of that capability to prepare for it, to anticipate it, and to produce the drugs that could combat it. That's more personal. That's very personal. Yeah.
John, did you want to get in on that answer as well? Professor Fong, can I just ask you a quick follow-up? Is there a link between public health risks and climate change increases?
Yeah, there have been a lot of studies, we call disease vectors, mosquitoes, all of that have moved north, have moved to wetter and have moved north. So yes, and we can go into all the deaths. I get lost on all the big numbers, like 500,000 people displaced and so many people dead in the heat wave of Europe, etc. You see these massive the people get sick and climate change. We are designed to live in a certain range of temperatures. Okay, so when it is too hot, we cannot, if you go to the tropics, when it gets too hot and it is humid, you cannot evaporate, you're just sweaty all the time. You cannot evaporate, and so you cannot cool, okay, etc. And then you cannot work for extended periods in the desert. The climate change is there everywhere, okay, in the public health, in our health, in our well-being, because we're just designed to live in a certain range. And when the environment goes beyond that range, the crops die, the fish don't do well, we don't do well, etc. So we are tied to this. We are built for this earth for a particular range of temperatures, particular set of climates. And yes, we can talk about building seawalls or building reservoirs, but I don't know how to, how to readapt myself to a different climate.
We're getting toward the end, and I need to start wrapping up. And we have 3 questions that came in that seem related to me. So let me ask them to you as a group. The first is, with the clock at 85 seconds today, how does the bulletin communicate urgency without normalizing a permanent state of crisis or fatalism? And just to add a detail to that particular question, the bulletin has been coming to do this with conflict resolution at Georgetown off and on since 2020. So several iterations of this. And every time we've done it, the clock has moved closer to midnight, I believe. So in my experience with the clock, it's been this inexorable creeping toward, existential dread. So I feel that question in my experience. We have another question that says, what have been some of the most prominent challenges in quantifying the levels of risk and threat that determine what time the clock is set, at which the clock is set? And then we have a third question that asks, how do we prepare for an ethics to preserve life? Which is a lovely overarching question. So maybe I can ask you to tackle those as you see fit, or to maybe weave them together as you see fit.
Well, I can start, but so a few things. Yes, since 2010, the clock has only moved forward. So that, perception is accurate. However, before that, the clock would routinely move back and forward, and it's really gone back and forth over the years. So, although it may seem locally as if there's this inexorable slide to doom, that is really not, at least the way I think about it. The hope is that this is a temporary state of affairs, and that sort of humanity wakes up, which I think in many ways is already, like, for example, for climate, that's clearly already happening, and that actions are taking to turn back the clock. So again, this is this question of hope versus despair, and the exercise, our goal is to leave, people hopeful and energized to make a difference, not in fetal position. And how to do that when your main mechanism for public engagement is the doomsday clock. That's, tricky. But I think the hope is that we have this symbol, we make this announcement, it gets visibility, it sort of interrupts the news cycle for a little bit, encourages everyone to step back and take the bird's eye view of the state of humanity, and then hopefully get to work on addressing the threats. So this is something where we're always looking for ways to kind of end up with a more positive message, while still, what our task is to soberly assess the state of the world and report what we find, consulting with experts and really trying to wrestle with where are we? And unfortunately, our assessment since 2010 is that the progression is not good. So, we're not painting a rosy picture that everything is going fine, but we are painting a rosy picture in the sense that there's plenty to do to turn back the clock. This kind of ties into quantifying. So I'll stop there. I don't want to take up all the airtime, but then I'm happy to kind of circle back on the quantifying levels of risk and then ethics.
I'll just make a couple of basic observations. It's a great question about how we avoid fatalism and how we avoid, if we're moving the clock closer to midnight, do we just sort of make it harder for people to pay attention and tune out? I've been working on nuclear weapons for many, many decades, and I wasn't always very popular at parties. That's why I had to develop a, sort of side personality. But the reality is the reality. And you're not going to get better. We're not going to solve these problems by ignoring them and not talking about them. I think if I were to come in and say, like, we're all doomed and walk away, then, okay, I think there's a fair critique there. But as Daniel said, and as we pointed out multiple times, we don't just set the clock and say, okay, we're doomed. We actually publish a magazine. We have a website. We have a statement that lays out specifically what we could do to turn back the hands of time. And so, the message we want people to take away is not we're doomed. It's that these are big problems and they're getting worse. And we have the technology and the means and the knowledge to make them better. We just have to want to do it. Now, in a democratic country, we have lots of proven tools that make that work. We're not suggesting that what will work here will work in Russia or China. And one of the questions in the chat is, how do you make autocrats care about what's in the best interests of their people, not just themselves? And you have to find ways and areas where that overlaps. If there's something that's really good for us, it would also be good for the people of Russia and China, and we can make it in the interests of their leaders to get it done, then why not? So, for example, Vladimir Putin would love nothing more than to demonstrate that he's not just invaded Ukraine, but he's back on the global stage and in the good graces of sort of international civilized society, whatever you want to call that. Well, one way to do that is to sign an arms control treaty. And if the United States thinks there's a benefit in not having a global arms race, that would be good for us. It would actually be good for the Russian people. If Putin gets a win out of it, but it's still good for us, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, you have to decide, do you want to do business with people like that? But we worked with Brezhnev and Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders, and so there's a strong precedent for that. But that, I think, is where the real work comes in. Right now, quite frankly, the United States is not really even putting in the real work. We're operating simply on instinct and ego.
I'll make an attempt at the third question. I think that it's a tough question because we come from we celebrate our differences. We celebrate the backgrounds, our very different backgrounds, our different cultures, whether I like spicy food and, etc. All came from, it's an integration in my world, it's an integration of my whole life. And so this is to me where the understanding where everyone comes from, the different values we all have, and how we come about to have our values. And then now this is taking something, and please, John and Dan disagree with me, is that when I watch the AlphaGo, the AI, it's absolutely AlphaZero that beats AlphaGo. Okay, AlphaZero is no training, whereas AlphaGo is training on everything on the Go game. So what I took from that is that if you ask everyone what their goals are for the whole globe, for all the inhabitants, rather than for me, what we used to asking is what is best for my family, what is best for my community, what is best for my country, etc. But if we just say ask children, school children, young children, what they see for the whole earth, for the whole planet, and how do we work together and build that, to get the planetary view. Okay, we're on spaceship Earth. Okay, so how do we maintain spaceship Earth? Yes, I can blame my parents; they didn't know any better. Okay, but how do we go forward to preserve spaceship Earth for everyone? And if we ask that early, and if we ask that repeatedly, that gets that whole global planetary view and how we have to collaborate with one another to get somewhere, to survive. You know, we are on planet, we are on a spaceship Earth. So I hope that the education, yes, I'm echoing what Dan said, education, but education not just in what we're doing, but sharing values, understanding what is important to each and every one of us or to different cultures. And then ask the question, how do we have spaceship Earth go for the next generation?
Yeah, and this, I mean, just to amplify that, and this may be kind of a simple-minded physicist not understanding nuances of ethics, but in this particular case, it seems like things align. You can appeal to naked self-interest, or you can appeal to, global, we share one atmosphere and we share one planet Earth. Either way, the things that we're worried about specifically for the Doomsday Clock, uh, no matter what your kind of ethics is, I would guess for almost everyone, it's in your self-interest to avoid a nuclear exchange, for example, or a completely inhospitable planet to human life. These are things which I think can kind of bind us together, because just the kind of self-interest aligns with any broader ethical argument you might have. I would hope, um, and that's actually part of the reason that gives me hope, even to this question of autocratic leaders. Even autocratic leaders, although their narrow self-interest may be in preserving their power, I think the notion that everyone perishes helps kind of focus the mind, and even in their self-interest, there are probably ways to appeal to that to make progress. So maybe that's a kind of depressing lens to look at this, but I feel like, this is one of these things where, since we're talking about the grandest scale, it kind of helps us make the argument and bring people along with us.
I hear you, just to cap it, and then we need to end, but I hear the alignment of interests and incentives with global values. So I appreciate that framing. And I also appreciate the fact that you're pointing us toward tools toward moving the clock in the other direction. And so I think with that, I need to say thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming back to virtual Georgetown to be with us again. Next year on the hilltop, weather permitting. So thanks to my students as well. And thanks to everyone on YouTube. I think that is the end of our afternoon together. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.